long-term interests in. We're looking the road ahead, Islam and Europe in the 21st century. So this is an opportunity to break out our crystal ball and look to the future. We have three very well-experienced and well-prepared specialists to help us do that. You have their bios with your material. I won't go into it, but let me say that all of them have worked extensively on the issues that this panel covers. And we will have each of them speak about 12 minutes and then leave as much time as we can for discussion and exchange among the panelists and among the morning speakers as well. So our first speaker is Dr. Daniel Pipes, Director of the Middle East Forum and a longtime specialist and writer and speaker on issues relating to Islam and the modern world.
Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This morning, Dr. Chesery said that Muslims in Europe don't want to change the nature of Europe. But I also note that the distinguished German professor of Syrian origins, Bassam Tibi, posits a more open question. He says either Islam will be Europeanized or Europe will be Islamized. And I tend to agree with Bassam Tibi that it's an open question. I'm not sure whether we know whether Muslims in Europe want to change the nature of Europe or whether they'll succeed in changing the nature of Europe or not. And so what I thought I'd do in my few minutes is to give the arguments for both sides of this topic. Will Europe be Islamized or will Islam be Europeanized? And to start with, I think there are some compelling arguments for believing that Europe will be Islamized. In the first place, one has a dramatic collapse of faith in Europe. It's striking to note, by way of footnote, that some 25 years ago, the differences between Europe and the United States were rather minor compared to what they are today. And so many of the attributes that I'll mention now really are developments of the last quarter century. One has seen extreme secularism come into play in most European countries and among the elites in particular. And one pungent way of making this point is that in London, one finds more Muslims in the mosques on Friday than Christians in the churches on Sunday, despite the fact that there are perhaps 8 times more or 7 times more Christians in London than Muslims. And it's an aggressive kind of secularism that has taken hold in Europe, something that we as Americans are pretty unfamiliar with. The second point in favor of the argument that Europe will be Islamized is a demographic collapse. The total fertility rate, as you probably know, that's required to replace one's population is 2.1 children per woman, and in Western Europe the average today is about 1.4, or 2/3 of what it needs to be. 1/3 of the population that's needed for the future is not there and is found instead either through immigration or there's a diminution of the population. A third, and much of that population, of course, that is coming to Europe is Muslim, in part because it's close by. It's only 13 kilometers, 16 kilometers from Spain to Morocco, only a couple hundred from Italy to Libya, or from Italy to Albania, in part because, as was mentioned this morning, of colonial ties from, say, the South Asian subcontinent to Britain. And so one has a surge of Muslim immigrants. And finally, there is what is called political correctness, but I think is a deeper phenomenon than political correctness, an alienation of many Europeans from their own heritage, a sense that there's not much of worth in it, that one's own culture is not really that worth saving. And it's striking here to see the differences within Europe. Perhaps the country least prone to this alienation is France, and perhaps the country most prone to it is the United Kingdom. A bit surprising that it should be that way, but so it is. On the other side, in terms of the Muslim side of why Europe will be Islamized, is the jihad ideology, radical Islam in general, seeing Europe as a continent to be converted, a continent for dawah. Secondly, there's the high fertility of Muslims, the flip side of the low fertility of the indigenous Christian population of Europe. And while, as was pointed out this morning, that fertility rate is coming down, it is still several times higher than the European indigenous populations. Mohammedan number of cities, for example, Brussels and Amsterdam has been for some years the most popular name for infant boys. There's also a disdain, pervasive disdain among Muslims for European civilization, and perhaps the best illustration of that is the whole area of sexuality, pornography, divorce, homosexuality, and the rest. And here, by way of footnote, it's ironic to note that in centuries past, it was the Europeans, it was the Christian Europeans who looked at the Muslim world with disdain for its overt, alleged anyway, overt, blatant sexuality, harems, and multiple wives, and the freedom that Europeans saw in the Muslim world in centuries past. So, to sum up this argument that Europe will be Islamized, Europe has an open door, and the Muslims are walking in and will change it. But there's another side, which I'd also like to point out, that Islam might be Europeanized. That is to say, to be turned into a European phenomenon, or as Stephen Schwartz likes to use the metaphor, that in the United States, Islam will sit at the great table of American religions. Will Islam sit at Europe's table of religions? And arguments in favor of thinking that Islam will be reduced to a phenomenon that fits within Europe are in the first place a European reaction to Islamization. And one can see this in various nativist reactions that have so far done not all that well, but certainly have a future. And one thinks of Jörg Haider and the Freiheitliche Partei Österreichs, which was in office for a brief period, the Lega Nord in Italy, which has been part of the ruling coalition. In Denmark, the Conservative Party coming to power for the first time after, if I have my numbers right, 73 years, basically because of the immigration issue, and also doing well in other countries. The presidential race in France a few years ago was between Chirac and Jean-Marie Le Pen. There are insurgent parties in many other countries. Now, these are nativist, in some cases, parties with neo-fascist backgrounds, but they have a message, and a message that resonates, a message that is likely to be stronger rather than weaker in the future. More broadly, one sees a chafing among Europeans, not so much elite Europeans, but the European populations at the changes that are taking place in their countries. One can see illustrations of that, for example, with the hijab legislation in France, the unhappiness with the inability to have overt Christian signs, the dissatisfaction with the arrogance of the Islamists. I don't know which way it's going to go in Europe. I don't really have any idea. My crystal ball is cloudy. But I do think that this is a key issue, not just for Europe, but for all of us. Europe has been the motor force of world history for the last half millennium. And while it's certainly no longer in that position, it is still a vital continent. And which way it goes will be in very large part determined by the answer to this question. And the rest of us will be much affected. And it's worth noting that this is an unprecedented question. I, as a historian, know no analogous shift of civilization done peacefully through a collapse of population, collapse of faith, immigration, economic opportunity. There is nothing like this. We have no precursors for this. So we really are in terra nova. And just a final note, unrelated to that larger question. It has come up a few times this morning about the role of poverty and frustration, unemployment, the pathologies of the ghetto in Europe, which are so widespread, and their absence in the United States. The American Muslim population is of a much higher socioeconomic standard, educational background. There are no ghettos in this country. And so there are no Muslim ghettos in this country. Thank you. There are no banlieues in this country. And therefore, Europeans tend to look at the United States this as a model. And I don't argue that socioeconomically the Muslim population of the United States is far better off than in Europe, better integrated into the economy, into the society. No argument there. But I do dispute the notion that that is a way to obstruct the jihadi mentality. I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that it is disaffection, it is unemployment, or other problems that lead to jihadism, that lead to violence. Indeed, I would argue that it is sociology is nearly immaterial. This is a body of ideas that the radical Islamic ideology that can attract anyone, poor or rich, male or female, old or young, European or American. And I just jotted down earlier a few examples of American converts to Islam, none of whom were in any kind of stress situation. These are converts. These are not people who came from abroad, but who were all arrested and now in jail or fled the country because of terrorism or attempted terrorism. Ryan Anderson, a white convert in Washington State. David Belfield, a black convert who murdered an Iranian exile in the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Clampton Rodney Hamptonell, a black convert who was part of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Mark Fidel Cools, a black convert who fragged his officers in Kuwait. John Walker Lind, the notorious American white Marin County convert. John Muhammad Allen, the Beltway sniper. Randall Royer, the Virginia jihadi, paintball jihadi. All of these people, from what one can tell, had no particular stress, did not grow up in an environment of anti-democratic or immigrant environment. And there are many, many other examples of Americans who have no particular stresses in their lives. A recent case that really makes the point was Mohammed Azad Tabari, a graduate of University of North Carolina, did well liked, and 3 months ago in March, drove an SUV at the University of North Carolina into a crowd of pedestrians, hoping to kill as many as possible. Fortunately, he killed none, but he'd been planning that for 2 years, and his statements to the press were, jihadi statements. There's no indication that there was any kind of problem. Rather than look at the negative, one should look at the positive. What attracts people to radical Islam and to jihadist ideologies. And that, unfortunately, is not something that can be solved through socioeconomic means. Thank you.
Thank you. The second presentation will be by Dr. Sarah Silvestri, who is with the Center for International Studies at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Chair and dear organizers, many thanks for inviting me to this very enriching conference and to such a prestigious International Research and Policy Center. The title of this session is concerned with the road ahead for Islam in Europe. And I find that commenting on this is a daunting task. Firstly, because the previous speakers have covered a range of issues and topics that I've planned to discuss. Perhaps I'll make links to them, but I won't expand on them as I planned earlier on. And also, it is difficult to make predictions about a phenomenon which is in progress. It's still in Islam in Europe is developing, and Muslims, not only Muslims but also European citizens, are constantly growing, and there are several problems that European society is facing disconnected to the issue of European Islam. So what I will try to do today is point primarily at two issues, or set of issues and transformations and challenges that are facing both Muslims and non-Muslims in Europe. And Professor Cesari earlier on rightly pointed out to the fact that not only Muslims are transforming Europe, but also Europe is transforming Muslims and European Islam. And so I will also try to put a few things that were said today into a broader perspective. The first main issue which is at stake here is an issue of identity. Especially after 9/11 and all the terrorist attacks in Europe and outside Europe that were carried out by people that were fighting allegedly in the name of Islam, Europe has been increasingly questioning Muslims about what Islam is. On the other hand, Muslim practices and certain doctrine for the past seem to challenge certain principles and certain values that are characteristic of European society and European history. So, in analyzing this dynamic of interrelations between Muslims in Europe and European society, we realized that, first of all, that neither European states, neither Muslims can be regarded as cohesive entities. Europe is an amalgam. By Europe, perhaps I should point that I'm primarily dealing with the European Union, is an amalgam of states which are still very strongly attached to their own sovereignty. And although they've been trying to interact with each other and to develop common policies, it's difficult to say that there is a European identity in the same way as there is an American one, because people are very jealous of their characteristics, of the regional identity, about the specific history, the particular mentality that has developed in a particular region. For instance, if we take the issue of intercultural relations and the relations between different communities, we cannot say that there is one European approach. You have the multiculturalist approach in the UK and in Holland, and then you have, for instance, the assimilationist pattern, which is characteristic of France. And again, if you want to address the issue of secularism, okay, the West in general has adopted an attitude which is secularist, but interpretations of secularism vary greatly across European countries, depending on the philosophy, on the history which has marked particular countries. So the Enlightenment and philosophy has still left a very strong mark in France, where you cannot really speak of religion in the public sphere. You cannot wear religious symbols in states' buildings and so on. In Italy, the fact that Italy hosts the Vatican in its territory definitely has marked the way Italian society relates to religious communities, and has led to a particular privileges being given to the Catholic Church. In the UK, you have an established religion, that of the Church of England, and yet, because of historical developments, nowadays Britain is perhaps one of the most secularized places in Europe. Perhaps in itself, and we discussed it amply this morning when Wahhabism and Sunnism and Deobandism were discussed, Islam is perhaps even less homogeneous than discussing Islam. That is more difficult than discussing European identity, because of the fractures that exist along historical, doctrinal, geographical lines that characterize the Muslim inhabitants of Europe. And the characteristics that differentiate Muslims in the Muslim states are perhaps even more visible when they come into Europe, because when all these individuals are transplanted from Asia, from North Africa, from the Gulf, and so on, you have all this microcosmos coming into, existing into Europe, and people living a very short distance from each other, and yet perhaps not communicating to each other, because people still gather and go to mosques and form organizations primarily along national or ethnic or linguistic lines. So you have, for instance, mosques where people talk Arabic because they're attended by Muslims of Arab origins, and you have mosques where people tend to speak Urdu, and so on. And there is actually quite there are dynamics of rivalry between many associations and Muslim organizations that exist in Europe. To go back to the also the challenges that Islam presents for Europe, the fact that Muslims have come up in the last 10 to 15 years in the public sphere, participating in social and political life by reasserting their allegiance to their religion, has created a chaos in European mentality. It seems as if Islam was challenging European values. If we see people in Europe are still not educated enough to understand the variety of Islamic interpretations that exist in Islam, of theological and doctrinal differentiations that exist in Islam. So people are scared that Islam wants to take over, that Sharia is going to be applied in Europe, and when cases extreme cases such as the demonstrations against the cartoons of Muhammad in February took place in the streets of Europe, there was a great fear across Europe that Islam is going to challenge European values of freedom of speech, of toleration, and of democratic political participation in the democratic system. And on the other hand, Europe is scared and shocked by the fact that Muslims are reasserting their identity and their participations along the lines of religion, because Europe is going through a big crisis, a big identity crisis about its own history, about its own values, and about the purpose and the essence of this political organization which has been formed, the EU, which seems to be at a standstill when Turkey is at the door and trying to get into Europe. When we talk of identity, of a crisis of identity, I think there is also well, I said earlier I want to put things into perspective, because when we speak of Muslims and the problem of the radicalization of the young generation, we seem to forget that in Europe, in general, there is an increasing problem of communication between generations. There is a generational gap. And we say that imams in the mosque are out of touch with the younger generation, with what people are doing. Well, I wonder, are priests in Catholic churches or rabbis in their own temples in touch with the youth? No. When you say that Muslims are demonstrating in the streets and or in violent ways rather than participating in the normal political system according to the structures which are there to exist, what about the low percentage of people that vote in national elections? What about the general mistrust and disgust for what our democratic systems are doing for their own citizens? What about the dislike of European citizens for the foreign policies of their own governments? So when we discuss the problem of identity. Yes, there are challenges that Islam is posing to Europe, and that Europe is posing to Islam. But also there is a lot of positive interaction going on, and there is a convergence, for instance, in political movements, non-conventional political movements, I can say. For instance, in the UK last year, the Make Poverty History campaign was launched, and many Christian, secular and Muslim organizations participated in it. So this is an example of a positive interaction which is going on, and where identities are, each group maintains its own identities and fights for the same cause without rejecting their own origins, and actually finding common values. Again, for the anti-war demonstrations in 2003 against the UK foreign policy and the decision to go to war in Iraq, again, you could find people of different backgrounds campaigning together. The other issue which is at the heart of my studies, and an article is actually forthcoming on this, is how the problem that both Europe and Muslims are facing about organizing religion in society and about developing appropriate measures for governments to relate to religious organizations and vice versa. Broadly, I'm late with my presentation, so I won't go into details about this, but broadly, Europe is a secular and Christian society, and so it has developed legal and political strategies for interacting with religious organizations, primarily along keeping as a format the traditional historical relations that the Catholic Church or the Christian churches have developed with the governments. And so the first attempt was to see whether Islam could fit into that pattern. But because Islam lacks a hierarchical organization, lacks one clear leadership, and it's so much fragmented into different doctrinal schools, so European governments and Muslims, for their part, have been trying to find alternative strategies to relate to each other and allow Muslims to have a voice in the public sphere and to interact with the governments, passing by this particular structure. So we have seen the creation of Muslim consultative bodies and representative bodies, very often promoted actively by European states, because they had in mind the idea of promoting an artificial notion of moderate Islam, and therefore stopping the rise of extremism and Islamic fundamentalism. For their part of the Muslim communities across Europe have bought this discourse of moderate Islam, and some just have participated into this format of Muslim councils, as I call them, simply for opportunistic reasons, because that was the only pattern available, that was the only channel available to make their views, inform their views with their views European society. And other groups have remained very aggressive and hostile to this pattern, because it seems as if governments in Europe want to domesticate European Islam. Of course, the problem of creating appropriate organizations and appropriate channels for Muslims to relate with the governments has also triggered a series of dynamics, of very interesting political dynamics I won't describe further because I'm late, but among Muslim organizations, and as well between Muslim organizations and political parties, non-Islamic, just secular political parties, and between political parties themselves. I know the British sphere better than others, and for instance, everybody studying the field knows that the Muslim Council of Britain is a creature of the new Labour Party, and that has gone into decline almost at the same time as the Labour Party went into decline in the past 2 years because of the connections with the war in Iraq. The Liberal Party has tried to to attract all those Muslims that previously used to vote Labour Party and now have become disaffected and by the policies pursued by the Labour government. And therefore, there is even another third example of another party which was created about a couple of years ago, the Respect Party, that again, chaired by Mr. Galloway, which again is trying to run a more extremist line and trying to draw on the most disaffected Muslims and the most angry against the Labour Party. So there is a competition between secular political parties about gaining the vote of the Muslims. And within themselves, Muslim organizations and Muslim individuals are fighting for gaining the recognition of the official establishment and of the other Muslim fellow citizens. The Muslim Council of Britain has gone through a crisis of legitimacy because it was created by a group of self-appointed leaders. And as someone was saying this morning, these leaders tend to come from one particular pool of people coming from Southeast Asia and with distant connections to the Jamaat Islamic group. With the 7/7 bombings, further dynamics developed. Muslims that would not come out in the public sphere to express their views about Islam, about the relationship between Islam and politics in Europe, and about their allegiance to the British, to the national, not to comment on their religious and national affiliation, came out because they found themselves under the spotlight and needed to give an answer to whoever was questioning Islam and questioning the connections with the radicalism. So with 7/7, various organizations were called by the government to form a task force that would address the issue of the problem of radicalization. But for the first time, perhaps because also government officials realized that the Muslim Council of Britain had not done a good job in representing the views of the Muslims to the state, and also had lost its little contacts with had lost any trust on the part of the Muslim community. So the government tried to invite a broad range of voices to participate in discussions about how to develop policies that would counter the radicalization of Muslim youth, so policies from education to job to security issues and so on. Another organization also came up, again it was mentioned this morning, the British Muslim Forum, that surprisingly represents the voice of the Sufi, that until 7/7, Sufi groups in general do not participate into politics. It's a very spiritualistic and it's very private, it's a religious movement very much concerned with the private individual life, spiritual life of a person. But in that case, the situation was so problematic that they found they needed to speak. So the fact that more voices came up in the public sphere in the UK was a positive outcome of 7/7. In general, recommendations, I'm finished. Recommendations for the future. First of all, I think it's dangerous to put people into boxes. So when someone asked this morning what kind of policies should the EU or individual EU member states push in order to help the Muslim communities. I think it's a bit dangerous to force people to fit into boxes and categorization. Say, I'm a Sunni, I'm a Shia, I'm a Deobandi, I'm a Sufi, and so on, because there is a large number of people that do not have a clear identity. They were brought up in contact with many realities, and they are likely to come from could come from a Deobandi family, but in fact when they go to school or when they go to the workplace, they might come into contact with other Muslims that practice other traditions within Islam. I know persons that have approached Sufism and previously were coming from more Asian-style families, and so on. And also there is a large number of people that have become very, very secularized, and they resent the fact of being tagged as Muslims and being forced to define themselves in this way. They would regard themselves first of all as citizens, and they would like to benefit and to enjoy the rights of any citizen about participation and having opportunities to get work, not because they're Muslims, but because of their qualifications and so on. So what should we do? I think, again, it's dangerous to insist too much on positive actions because of this very same reason, although to a certain extent initially they are kind of to be welcomed. In general, I think education is something to be pursued intensely. Education about Islam, but also education about European history, about the origins of European political thought, about the origins of European ethics. Because there is an awareness, a very, very strong awareness about this. Thank you.
Our final presentation will be from Dr. Kemal Silay, who's chairman of Ottoman and Turkish Studies at Indiana University. Kemal.
As I'm trying to figure out the PC.
Closer. Microphone.
Let me start by saying that I'm humbled by the invitation from the Wilson Center, even though I am not even a political scientist. I also would like to thank the European Institute and the Center for Islamic Pluralism. I should mention that I'm also serving as its president and enjoying working with Steven Schwartz very much. Thank you, sir. Well, anyway, let me mention that my interest in Islamic studies was because of the fascinating Islamic civilization that I was studying, and I am still studying as a professor since the student years. It was particularly its literature and music. But today, in the 21st century, like all of you in this room, I believe, I'm trying to figure out what this thing called Islamism. And I'll do a little attempt to I believe, defined what an Islamist is, but of course mine is not going to be a final version. I think what an Islamist is a very important question, and this article, this list, needs to be written in a collaborative manner, but not by one person. Political events in many Muslim countries, especially the emergence of Islamist movements with anti-Western undertones, resurrected old fears and negative images of Islam. Because some segments of Europe's Muslims found Islamist discourse and some even acted upon it, they damaged the image of all Muslims. As a Muslim living in the United States for almost 20 years, I could not agree more with these important introductory statements made in an edited volume entitled Islam, Europe's Second Religion. However, beyond the initial pages, it became clear that this book was another frustrating example of the dominant contemporary scholarship's failure to distinguish Islam as a cultural phenomenon and Islamism as a political and militant program. These two very different concepts were mixed and confused throughout the work, thus further complicating the key issues of immigration, integration, assimilation, and accommodation taken up within its pages. In his article entitled The Muslim Diaspora and the Islamic World, John Esposito represents his ideas of Islam and Islamism and once again fails to distinguish the two. His firm apologetic position manifested in his labeling of Hasan el-Banna, Seyyid Qutb, Mevlana Maududi, Necmettin Erbakan, Fethullah Gülen, and others as either, quote, Islamic activists or, quote, Muslim intellectuals who are training Muslim students, seems to serve the interests of Islamism rather than that of Muslims or the field of Islamic studies. Esposito does not seem to find any problems with defining the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Rafah as Islamic activist organizations. In his Europeanization of Islam or Islamization of Europe, question mark, Tariq Ramadan takes a fundamentalist approach in trying to deal with the issue at hand. According to Ramadan, quote, Muslims have to do what is strictly prescribed. If one wants to pray, one needs to have a text specifying how to perform it. This essentialist stance assumes the existence and uniformity of an Islamic world which in reality does not exist and perhaps never did. It ignores the pluralism of all the societies of Islamic heritage and their multiple interpretations of Islam throughout the centuries. Ramadan seems to advocate for what I call the textualization of Islam through some imagined fundamentalist authority, which is actually and has always been created by the political establishment of a given time and space. This authority decides what Islam is and how the Muslims of the world should follow it. This rather dangerous approach is further fortified by Ramadan's statement that, quote, Sharia is the Muslims' way to remain faithful to their universal principles anywhere in the world, end quote. Ramadan believes that all Muslims are part of the same understanding of the Sharia. Perhaps my position comes from my Turkish cultural background and my own possible biases. But I feel rather fortunate that the Islam I grew up with had nothing to do with the Islam Mr. Ramadan hopes to establish in Europe for European Muslims. Even the medieval Ottomans did not base their social order solely on the concept of Sharia. They had a need to create man-made secular laws and began doing so starting in the 15th century. Even the Kemalist Republic of Turkey, while doing away completely with such medieval concepts as Sharia, provided no threat to Muslims and their freedom of belief and worship, but tried to eliminate the social conditions that might allow the development of Islamism, which ranges from theoretical Islamism to the terrorism we know only too well in our century. The Kemalist revolution did this by establishing a state which separated Islam from politics, thus confining Islam to personal conscience. Of course, the Islamist infiltration since the 1980 military coup exists. Milli Görüş, AKP, İbdace, Hizbullah, and various Nurcu movements do exist in Turkey. And this actually, in recent years, has come to an alarming level, but I am not really going into that with you today. I will leave the detailed explanation of these political parties or militant organizations to political scientists. Anyway, going back to the beginning of my discourse on Esposito and Ramadan. Both Esposito and Ramadan are by all means free to express their interpretations of any subject or concept in a civilized, democratic society, although they may not enjoy that freedom in the kind of fundamentalist Islamist regime that they seem to be at least flirting with. But their naive postmodern, and in the case of Ramadan, fundamentalist positions regarding Islam cannot succeed in re-establishing the image of Muslims as a significant part of the world's civilization. Nor can they promote the beautiful faces of popular Islam as a normal, tolerant, loving religious tradition. The Turkish and Ottoman Islam could tolerate, for example, the court poets' direct criticism and dislike of the orthodox interpretations of the religion. Some even criticize the holy book itself. The greatest Turkish Sufi poet of all time, Yunus Emre, could depict the 5 orthodox pillars of Islam as nothing but, quote, crimes, and still be tolerated and dearly loved, while the relatively new ideology called Islamism would not hesitate to take away thousands of lives in the 21st century in the name of its text-based Islam. The interaction of Islamist or jihadist ideology with the Quran is a fundamentalist one, a rigid, intolerant, and reductionist political endeavor. The interaction of the majority of the world's Muslims with the same text is usually a less textual or linguistic, since Arabic-speaking Muslims are the minority in the world. They actually have a handicap there called language. And more ritualistic traditional communication. Yet the Islamist elite in our century seems to be convinced that Sharia is the Muslims' way to remain faithful to their universal principles anywhere in the world. That means, may it be in a Muslim country, in Europe, or the United States. What would Mr. Ramadan or other Islamists think if they could see that hundreds of Ottoman Turkish Islamic manuscripts did not cite the Quranic verses correctly, and their Turkish renderings were more like approximations than accurate translations? How would they react if they were to discover that, for centuries, Anatolian Muslims created their own versions of Islam, the Quran and Muhammad, freely mixing it with elements from Judaism, Christianity, or pre-Islamic Turkic religious traditions? What if they were to discover the fact that in the folios of thousands of Ottoman literary manuscripts, Muslim poets were freely expressing getting intoxicated with this worldly wine or sometimes other substances? and depicted their sexual interactions with their beloveds. Similarly, do the Islamists have a plan for the spiritual needs of the millions of Alevis in Turkey and in Europe? Does their text-based Islam have any room for addressing the Alevids' need for more jam houses and not for more mosques? If a universal Sharia mechanism were to be imposed upon all the Muslims of the world, I am afraid only a fraction of the 1.6 billion Muslims would be Muslim enough. The rest would be persecuted as heretics. The Sharia is not a Coke product. You can't have a diet version of it. We are the soldiers of Allah. Allah is great. These were the words of a Turkish lawyer named Alparslan Arslan, who on May 17, 2006, entered the second bureau of the Turkish Council of State and opened fire upon 5 judges who were then in a legal session. The judges had previously ruled in a case involving the ban of the headscarf. With a law degree from Istanbul's Marmara University, with connections to the Turkish Hizbullah and Islamo-fascist mafias, Aslan attempted to take their lives inspired by the instructions of a medieval law. A similar case had occurred in 1995 when a Turkish jihadist named İzzet Kıraç killed Ali Günday, the head of the Gümüşhane Bar Association, in the name of, again, Sharia. Ali Günday had approved the court decision to ban the entrance of lawyers into court if they were wearing a headscarf. İzzet Kıraç was sentenced to life in prison, but somehow managed to spend only 6.5 years behind bars. Today, he's free, and his freedom allows him to make the following statement: I do not recognize any other law but Sharia. At this point, I'd like to actually share a few quotes which I believe somehow underscore the incompatibility of ideas espoused by some prominent Turkish Islamists and the fundamental principles of the West. How to turn Islam, the religion and culture, into Islam, the politics and militancy. Well, here's a billion-dollar question, and maybe someone else can help me understand this fully. But my question was, can an Islamist change? The following statements were made by some of the most influential Islamists in recent Turkish politics. Today, some critics believe that they have changed. Others think that theirs is simply a taqiyya strategy. Here is a former Prime Minister of the Republic of Turkey. Now the real problem for us is to decide whether Islamism, he says Islam, but it's clear that it's Islamism, so my brackets there, should be established softly or with blood. Like it or not, I am a member of the Hizbullah. Those who do not belong to the party of Allah belong to the party of Satan. To work for the party, at that time, I believe it was Refah, because this is from Recep Tayyip Erdogan's mayor years, is to work for Sharia. Well, I like the second one very much, actually. Democracy is a streetcar. We will ride on it until we reach our destination, then get off. Thank God I am a supporter of Sharia. They keep arguing that laicism is being lost. Listen, of course it will be lost if that is what this nation wants. We are going towards a new world where Islamism's just struggle will triumph over the imperialist West. Another major Islamist character, just a few quotes. The name of our task is jihad. The origin of the Jews and Crusaders' hatred of Islam, which continues to this day, goes back to the founding of Islam. the sole and only future power will be Islam. America will continue to be the source of orchestrations and terror. What the American soldiers do is nothing but tyranny. The greatest pleasure for a true believer is to take ablution with his own blood. These are a little older quotes like 1998 to 2001. Now let's get some recent ones. This is right after the Islamofascist attack to the Turkish judges. Our Prime Minister made a very important statement. We are going to make Turkey a safer country in order to protect the supremacy of laicism, democracy, and law. Mr. Gülen says, an insult to Atatürk is an insult to my nation. And I can't agree with him more here with his quote there. The politicization of Islam is a great betrayal to the spirit of Islam. Turkey is a secular state. If even Turkey, itself a Muslim country by tradition, cannot afford to integrate or accommodate Islamism, who should expect Europe or the United States to be obligated to fulfill Islamist demands or expectations? Then, when that very agenda is so hostile to the democracy and individual freedoms at their foundations. The future of Euro-Islam, or Islam in general, depends decisively on the world's commitment to identifying Islamists as such and weakening Islamism. If Islam is not separated from Islamism in contemporary discourses on Islam, there is no hope for the so-called process of effective integration. Followers of this religion, whether they are secular/cultural or practicing Muslims, can indeed be successfully integrated into any Western society, but not the followers of Islamism. Thank you very much for your patience.
See if we can find out. Can we turn this off?
Oh, yeah.
We've had three, right, thanks, quite clear and provocative presentations. We have some time for questions. If you will identify those to whom you're addressing the question to and identify your own self and an affiliation. We have microphones. The gentleman here in the back.
Hi, my question is for Daniel Pipes. And in the 21st century, they say that Denmark is going to be the first nation that the Islamic population is going to overtake the European population. When that happens, what do you conjecture would be the future, or the projected future?
Well, we have a specialist on Denmark here, so I'm not. I feel a little shy about answering that. Perhaps you want to take.
Well, not a serious threat.
I would say in demographic terms, the largest Muslim population of Europe in percentage terms is in France, in Western Europe, yes. New Muslim population, that is to say, is in France. The country of sort of Christian Europe, which is most likely first to become Muslim majority, would be Russia. Not a new population, an old population, but the Russian Christian population is going down rapidly, and the Muslim population is burgeoning, and it's I would say that would be the chances of Russia becoming majority Muslim are far greater than any other country of Europe.
Gentleman here.
Thank you for your lectures. My question is for Daniel Pipes. Well, I've read a lot of your articles on your website, and I read one of your articles where you were defending the cartoons publication of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, under the concept of freedom of expression. However, I read another article that was talking about the PBS channel broadcasting a film about, it's called Muhammad, a Legacy of a Prophet. And you have attacked it very aggressively, and you even advocated for a lawsuit against PBS. Now, my question is, do we have to defend and advocate freedom of expression only on occasions and only when it fits our agendas? And the second question is for all of the panelists, whoever wants to answer. I hear the words radical, extremist, fundamentalists used very often. Are these words interchangeable? Thank you.
On the question of the Danish cartoons, Denmark seems to loom large today. My position was really less about freedom of speech and more about imperialism, about an attempt to hold non-Muslim peoples to the standards of the Sharia, the imposition of the Sharia, be it on Salman Rushdie or on the Danish newspaper editors, and that, I believe, must be resisted. My argument about the PBS documentary on Muhammad was that it was taxpayer funded. If this had been done privately, I have no problem with it at all. But it was done through taxpayer funding. And anything that's done by the government must not propagate a religion. And that documentary I understood as propagating Islam, being a Sunday school version of Muhammad's life. And I contrasted it with the 2 or 3 year earlier PBS documentary on Jesus, which was nothing of the sort. It was a very critical, analytical, scholarly attempt to understand what we know these days, what the latest research is on Jesus' life. The Muhammad documentary was a pious presentation, talking about Muhammad going by horse from Mecca to Jerusalem one night and then going up to heaven. That's not the way. I mean, that's a pious presentation. That's not a scholarly presentation. So the key point is that we have freedom of speech, but the taxpayer-subsidized efforts by PBS and others must not be it public schools or other arenas, must not propagate religion.
Sarah, would you or Kemal?
I also wanted to make a point on the Islamization of Europe. Birmingham is definitely becoming the largest Muslim, the town with the largest Muslim population in the UK, with the Muslim population overcoming the non-Muslim. And this is going only to happen in 2015. I don't think this will cause any big change in the way the city is run. The city is the second largest city in the UK after London. Because after all, if you think at the elite level, it is the elites that tend to run any country. And the elites are those that adapt first to whatever is more convenient to their job, to their interests, and so on. So the Muslim elites do not differ very much from the non-Muslim elite in the UK. Concerning definitions, personally, I regard these three terms, fundamentalism, radicalism, and extremism, as just adjectives that can be used to define any political or social phenomenon. And in particular, if you think of political Islam, then you and of the ideology of Islam as it was defined this morning, you can see these are three shades of the way the ideology is brought forward. And none of the three necessarily relates to terrorism, actually. But the governments, the policymakers, at least in Europe, are not well prepared, are not well informed, and they are those that tend to use the terms. And very often in my writing, I replicate the terms that I use and I put them in inverted commas to specify, and then put footnotes to explain that I deliberately use them. And in my view, there is a growing, they're increasing, the connotation is stronger as you go from fundamentalism through radicalism to extremism. But this is not necessarily related to Islam. It's related to any political movement. And there's plenty of extremist political movements in Europe. But if you regard, I think very often the problem of the so-called Islamist terrorism should be detached from Islam and should be regarded as a problem of any extremist form of political violence that becomes terrorism.
Jamal, anything to add?
I mean, in terms of the terms used, of course, there is a confusion there. Sometimes people use words, simultaneously to define one concept, but I personally try to reduce it to fundamentalists, which means someone who believes in the fundamentals of a particular religion, even going back to its beginnings, right? In the case of Islam, you want to just do it as described in the Sharia way. And to define the rest of the people, basically I was talking about Islamists, I use the term Islamism. And even militant Islamism is not really necessary sometimes, because there is a concept of Islamism, and that Islamism can start as a theoretical endeavor, and with the right conditions can easily be transformed into terrorism or militancy. And if I could make one more comment on the depiction of Prophet Muhammad's face, yes, of course, what the Danish cartoonist did is freedom of speech. How he depicted a great religion's prophet is wrong, but we Muslims need to get used to criticism a little. That person does not need to know Islam. He's not a Muslim. I'm not a Christian, and by mistake, maybe I do something or taking advantage or benefiting from my freedom of speech in this country. Maybe I write something and I depict something, and that might be so offensive to many Christians. But that does not mean that we need to ban this altogether, that you cannot depict a picture or image of Prophet Muhammad. First of all, it is historically not correct. I believe it is a Wahhabi product that teaches that the face of Prophet Muhammad cannot exist. For centuries, Turkic, Iranian manuscripts depicted Prophet Muhammad freely. In today's Iran, you can just stop by any bookstore and get Muhammad pictures, his youth, and that somehow goes there. But when it comes to what happened in Denmark, there was an orchestrated attempt to mobilize Islamists, or rather use Muslims to join the Islamists for other purposes, unfortunately.
We have a number of people who want to raise questions, but we've promised our panelists we would let them go at 3. I'm going to take 2 more, and then others can come up and try and put questions after the session. Dr. El-Alawi.
This is a question for Sarah. When you mentioned that there are different Muslims, there's Wahhabis and Deobandis, and perhaps we should not box them up. But I think, don't you think it's important to highlight these issues and let people be aware? Although I can understand that there are some Deobandis who might be celebrating the Prophet's birthday, who might be inclined towards Sufism. Originally they were born as Deobandis of very stone families. But I think it is important that the people should be highlighted. Although the Deobandis might show some inclination by celebrating the Prophet's birthday, or the Wahhabis, but that doesn't simply make them a Sunni Muslim or a neutral belief, because they still have those hardcore embedded inside them.
And I was thinking that in general, you shouldn't force identities upon people. And many Muslims are brought up in a tradition, but they don't want to become a member of an organization or to, become affiliated with one particular form of Islam. They think I'm a Muslim. And because they see all these petty politics and rivalries going on between the organizations, and themselves many Muslims are scared of the extremist interpretations, then they end up, either distancing themselves completely from Islam and becoming like the secular Muslims and the musulman laïque, as they say in France. So I think that's the risk. And also on the part of the government, basically, if you use this categorization, if the government is trying to include people that are the so-called liberals, and you know and these people don't fit in any of the categories, then they are out of the game. They cannot give any voice, and that's dangerous. It's a problem for the whole Muslim community that maybe shares those views, because, as you know better than me, the majority is called the silent majority within the Muslim community.
Thank you.
The gentleman here in the second row. Yeah, thank you.
Hello, my name is Primož Trbenc, and I'm here as an associate of the Center for European Perspective from Slovenia. So we have already heard that Slovenia will take presidency of the European Union in the first half of 2008. And since doctors Silvestre and Silai opened a number of very interesting questions like Islam challenging values of Europe, about European identity and common values, I would like to emphasize that we in Slovenia for a long time lived together with Bosnian Muslims for more than 100 years, and we do know their language, we do know their culture, we do know their religious opinions. And therefore, I would like to emphasize that, in my opinion, if one would like to know some very inspiring views which would help us to resolve those questions, then we should look to Bosnian Muslims. However, I have a question for both, or for all three of you. On the one hand, we do know that Bosnian Muslims are extremely liberal. Their theologians and lawyers have very, very liberal views. For example, Fikret Kacic is emphasizing that in multicultural society there is only one appropriate solution. This is secular state, and there are others. So my question would be, on the one hand, it is often said that the Bosnian Muslims should be or could be, and I believe that they really can be a kind of bridge between the Islamic world on the one hand and the West on the other. On the other hand, we may equally somehow see Bosnian Muslims as a kind of island, because they can be also somehow separated from two banks, one of the Islamic world and the other from the West. Why I am implying this island? Because during the Bosnian War, or sometimes it is possible to get an impression that those Bosnian Muslims are too Islamic for Europe and not enough Islamic for some Islamic writers or some groups. And during Bosnian War, this is about the identity of Europe. During the Bosnian War, there were indeed some showings, let's say, with the great powers that they were not, the United Kingdom and France, they were not so much interested in crimes committed against Bosnian Muslims. So, bridge or an island? Thank you.
So who would like to take a
I
crack
can
at
start. That's a point I wanted to address, but I cut out because I was long. Yes, I believe that there can be a bridge. Simply, for the most simple reason to say this is because of the historical connections that the whole of the former Yugoslavia had with Europe. It's not, often people say that Turkey is going to be a bridge. I'm not too sure, whereas I'm more convinced that Bosnians can, because at least with Austria and with a certain part of Eastern Europe, with Hungary, for instance, the whole of the Muslim population of former Yugoslavia did have contacts up to the 19th century, the end of the 19th century. And actually, my idea is that whereas nowadays Muslims in Western Europe have problems in finding ways to relate officially, to institutionalize their communities and their relations with the states, now that we have Slovenia when we have Croatia in, and if we have any other Balkan country into Europe, it would be much easier for Western Muslims as well to institutionalize their religion and to have better official relations with the government. Nowadays, Dr. Mustafa Ceric, the Rais Ulema that was mentioned this morning, he's already highly regarded as a leading figure even in Western Europe. He's been in several visiting trips to the UK and to Germany and so on, and he's always acclaimed and welcomed by the local Muslim population, even if he's a Bosnian Muslim. And okay, he's the kind of big bishop of the, if you want to compare the position, although I know it's completely inappropriate, of the Muslim communities in the Balkans. He's already catering as a leading figure for several Muslim countries, not just in Bosnia. So the fact that he's already acclaimed in Western Europe shows the potential for the Muslims of the whole of Europe to find ways to institutionalize their religion better.
Good, thank you. Any final word, Dan? Kemal, would you like a final word, or can we declare victory and on?
A final word? No, I would never attempt to do that.
Well, please join me in thanking the panel for a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to meet you.
Keep in touch.